You're listening to international investment advisor Doug Goldstein on the Goldstein on Gelt show, the financial show where we'll talk about how you can make the most of your money. With all the confusing financial chatter bombarding you each and every day, Goldstein on Gelt will give you the practical information you want and need about living a financially stable life. Here's your host, money maven Doug Goldstein.
Okay, we are back. I'm very happy to bring back to the Goldstein on Gelt show best-selling author Amity Shlaes, who spoke to us before about her book The Forgotten Man, and has recently come out with a book about President Calvin Coolidge. Amity, a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
So Calvin Coolidge is not necessarily considered the most inspiring president out there. What made you write about him?
Well, this is the president. He was the 30th president of the United States. He served in the 1920s. I think the single answer is today we have a model of president as action figure, as action toy almost, where the U.S. president has to jump in everywhere and everything, whether it's a domestic challenge or an international one. And Coolidge was a champion of inaction. He ruled by doing little, or led by doing little. He wouldn't have even used the word rule, of course, and yet his results were so good. We had a very strong economy in the United States in the 20s. And another thing you want to mention, in fact, the one thing you do want to mention about him is Coolidge served for 67 months as U.S. president. And when he left, the federal budget was lower than when he came in. Nowadays, we tend to believe that's impossible for a president to leave, but maybe a president would reduce the increases, right? And here's someone who actually cut through concerted inaction.
All right. So those, not that I want to not learn from history, and I apologize because you are, of course, a historian, but times were a little bit different then. There was just not the same level of promises that governments had made to help people and to help the sick, and they didn't have the same kind of commitments to the old, and we have a lot more old people than they did then. So are we really comparing apples to apples?
Oh, I would say so. What I discovered in researching Coolidge is that there were strong progressive forces in the United States at that time. You want to remember that the Progressive Party sought, national ownership of electric power. For example, it liked the idea of owning the railroad, the principal method of transportation at that time. So it was an ambitious progressive party. And the year President Coolidge did run for president, you want to recall he came in when a president died. He was vice president. Then he had to run himself in 24. The progressives captured 17% of our U.S. vote for those radical ideas. And then there were the Democrats. So yes, there was strong pressure for certain government spending. Another example of something they endorsed too, the progressives were veterans who returned from World War I in pain. We had universal conscription in the United States in World War I. There were no antibiotics here. And they sought a pension, what we call a bonus, in the 20s. Coolidge turned that down, as he did. So it's not exactly like today. The U.S. government is much larger relative to the economy than it was at that point. But there are some strong analogies. And you want to remember, too, in Europe, the progressives were doing wild things. The socialists were doing wild things. There were revolutions. And at the time, we thought such a revolution might be possible in the United States. So to say no could be politically risky. America was a less stable place.
It seems that after he left, though, very soon after he left, things began to fall apart quite substantially. Was that because of his policies, or was that because of the new policies that then came in?
Well, in Forgotten Man, this book is the prequel to Forgotten Man, A History of the 1930s, and I had the pleasure of talking to your listeners about that years ago. Forgotten Man lists a number of reasons why the Great Depression happened. Remember, the Great Depression was long. It was a decade, starting with a crash. We'd had many other crashes in the United States with no Great Depression. And I list some of the reasons of this multi-causal disaster taking place over years, sort of like Japan more recently, right? A 10-year story. at each point a wrong turn, the Great Depression. One of those was we pushed up labor prices. Another was we increased the government's mandate and couldn't handle it. A third was we were absolutely arbitrary with the value of money in the 30s. In the face of a monetary problem, deflation. Yet another is we raised taxes, of course, we increased tariffs. All these things happened after Coolidge. They don't start with C for Coolidge. The only one of them that really you can affiliate him with is tariff, because he was a Republican and the Republican Party was always for tariffs, but he did not sign this famous, infamous Smoot-Hawley tariff. So I have trouble, having studied the Great Depression with Forgotten Men for so long, assigning blame to Coolidge for it. You want to know, too, that in the U.S., he felt the government intervention would set a bad precedent. So when the stock market went very high in the 20s, and it did disturbingly high, Coolidge was personally disturbed, but he did not want to set a precedent of Washington intervening. At the time, states regulated stock market, so it would have been New York State. This is a there are many cliches we believe. The crash caused the depression. The 20s caused the crash and the depression. You want to de-link them or unpack or uncouple all these cliches, because a lot of them, thinking people recognize they don't hold truth, these assumptions.
Okay, we are talking with Amity Shlaes, who is a columnist for Bloomberg. She's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. She's been on the Goldstein on Gelt show before, talking about her last book, The Forgotten Man. Recently came out with a book about Calvin Coolidge. She's been talking to us about some of his economic policies. So what could we learn from President Coolidge's economic policies that could be applied today?
Well, you read it together with Forgotten Man, and you'll see that Coolidge is the prequel. This is a Star Wars, right? Coolidge is the prequel. You read it together with Forgotten Man, and you see that a president who is less active, I call him the great refrainer in this book, can get good results, because we haven't spoken about it yet, but the results of the 20s were very interesting. We had strong growth in the U.S. in the 20s. We had low unemployment, barely noticed recessions. Our union membership dropped, and that's particularly relevant for Israel, even as wages increased in their purchasing power. The U.S. was basically a happy place in the 20s. We had a few sad spots. One was farming, but it was basically a happy place. And there's a wonderful book called Middletown, which I commend to your readers, a snapshot of the U.S. in 1920s by a pair of sociologists called Lind, and you'll see everyone got cars, everyone got washing machines, everyone got vacuum cleaners, electricities, and telephones, and our health got better here. It was an upbeat decade, and most of that sort of upbeat was real. That is to say, we saw productivity gains in our economy that were admirable. We saw patents increase in the U.S. very strongly. So all this is going on even as the government is pulling back. Our tax rate under Coolidge went down to 25%. That's lower than Ronald Reagan. And it's an era, why don't we know about this? I think working backwards, Doug, we want to justify what Roosevelt did as good. And since it took Roosevelt a decade to get us out of the Depression, well, whoever caused that before must have been mighty bad, or so the emotional logic, and therefore we want to ignore how good the 20s were. Well, but you want to separate emotional logic from true logic.
Certainly a lot of the Keynesians today are talking about how after our most recent real estate and credit crash a few years ago, by increasing taxes and increasing government spending, all of a sudden we're finding that unemployment has come down and that the stock market is flying again, and people seem to be in a little bit of a better mood, albeit perhaps a little bit on a shaky foundation. But it seems that you can learn take opposite conclusions from the two different recoveries.
Right, and it's important to understand that with the progressives, as strong as they were at a time when people believed in the progressive movement, you want to think about what was happening in your part of the world at that time or in Europe. Coolidge took an absolute majority of the vote, beating the progressives and the Democrats combined. It's possible in an economic crisis to go for free markets or less government, to force a recession, as we know. In the name of stronger growth subsequent to the recession. People are not sheep or rabbits. They have souls and thoughts, and they have memories, and they can look forward. And that's what Coolidge showed. So I think I would just stick with that.
Well, given the complexity of the way legislation is handled in the United States today, is it even possible to imagine that the subsidies and all the support programs could, in fact, significantly be changed and cut?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you're participating in U.S. arrogance when you assume the U.S. could never change. The U.S. will have its credit rating go down, and its currency will be challenged. Our unemployment rate today, down as it is not acceptable for U.S. standards unless we become like Europe. It should be below 5, not well above it. Our young people are unemployed, as in Europe and perhaps in Israel. That's not acceptable. Our young people, they're now seeing a mortgaged future, as you have and as Europe have, but we have historically not always had. So there will be a crisis. There will be a credit rating coming in, and then our people will need heroes. And what I would put to all of us is this Coolidge is a good hero. I wanted to mention for your listeners his attitude towards the Jews, because he did have an attitude. He studied ancient languages. I don't know if he knew Hebrew, but he knew Latin and Greek. He knew Italian. He translated Dante for his bride. So he actually had a view about the Hebrews in a kind of old-fashioned Bible-y way. His name is Calvin, as in Calvin, right? But also sort of an interesting respect for Jewish communities in the United States. And there's a famous conference call, rather like this one, though they did not have Skype, between him and the Federation of Jewish Philanthropic Societies of New York. And they were at the Hotel Pennsylvania, and he was where? In Washington. And he told them that he commended them for raising $7 million, which they had, and for budgeting so well. That is, for not being corrupt, for spending well. There's one thing that he said: I believe in budget. And he told them, I regard a good budget as among the noblest monuments of virtue. Isn't that funny?
That is funny. I think that would certainly be a positive thing for governments. As my day job is that I'm an investment advisor. I'm only on the radio once a week, and I spend a lot of time talking about budgeting and just not that I'm a budget advisor, but I think that's the fundamental tool that everyone needs in order to ultimately grow successfully and personally wealthy. And it seems that Coolidge and I would agree that governments should do the same thing. And you too, I suppose.
Coolidge was a Scrooge. He budgeted at the White House. He budgeted everywhere. He didn't tip well. But he honored what he was good at: contracts. He didn't trick people. He had a theory in business that we would all like to adopt, which is he wanted to do people so well that they would come back and do business with him again.
Oh, there's a good idea.
Rather than some kind of transactional, cynical ripoff, which is the other model we have here and also in Israel. I'll get what I can, ha ha. See you never again. The market is anonymous. He thought the market was not anonymous, and everyone knew everyone. And Doug would remember how Amity comported herself on his radio show, and Amity would remember Doug. And that is often the way business is, that we never do. The world is tiny. We never do not run into people we met before, actually. Even here, the market is not anonymous, even when it's vast, like international capital markets, and markets have memories, individuals have memories. So I like that about him. He tried to make everyone always want to do business with him again, and that too contributes, trust level to economic growth. One of the interesting things we discovered in the recent U.S. crisis is we didn't have good measures for trust and growth. That is, whether people trusted markets to invest in them or held back. We were insufficiently capturing that with our extant indices. And one of the ones I like very much is done by a new one by University of Chicago in combination with Northwestern Kellogg, a scholar there called Paola Sapienza. She tries to capture, do people trust the market and trust their investment partners? And I commend that to your listeners. Go have a look. It's the Chicago Booth Northwestern Kellogg Financial Trust Index, and that would be a good way for you to feel out markets as well. When trust goes up, people trade more frequently.
Very interesting. All right. We have been talking with Amity Shlaes, who just came out with a new book about Calvin Coolidge, a fascinating book. Amity, we're just about out of time, but tell me, in the last few seconds, how can people follow your work?
Well, I run a high school debate program that teaches youngsters how to think about economics with the George W. Bush Presidential Center. It's a presidential library where we do that kind of thing. And that's a lot of fun. So you can see us there. You can see me on amityshlaes.com, and you can see a lively discussion of the merits of Coolidge on my Facebook page, the one with the Coolidge picture.
Cool. All right. That sounds great. Amity, thanks so much again for coming back.
No, thank you.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt show.